If you ask the question, what are the most important challenges facing the world today? Most would talk about the pandemic, the trade war between China and the US, climate change, maybe automation, and the destruction of jobs. This video offers a more fundamental perspective to all these issues and more. Whether you are looking to understand where economic growth will come from in the future, identify new sources of risk, or you're seeking to resolve the major challenges facing humanity, it helps to understand the underlying megatrend that is driving the developments of the 21st century, including those developments that may not have yet reached the news. In this introduction to the 4Waves approach, we hope to share a new and practical perspective on all these issues and more. The 4Waves approach divides the world into four vastly different groups of countries or economies. This difference can be explained by one primary long-term trend: the great transition from an agrarian to an urban industrialized society. Usually, when we look at the world, we see where countries and societies are today and assume that things have always been this way. We assume that Europe and North America have always been rich and populous, and that China and India used to be wealthy and are merely returning to their natural state. We do not assume that all countries are in fact simply at one stage or another of a great transition from an agrarian to an urban industrialized society. We forget that just as the world's population grew by 4 billion in the 20th century, it is expected to grow by the same amount in the 21st century. We marvel at China's explosive growth as it moves almost 1 billion people from the countryside to cities in just 50 years. But we do not look at Africa or many other less developed regions of the world and see that they are simply at an earlier stage in the same development process that will see the equivalent of 3 new Chinas in the next 50 years. After 10,000 years of an agrarian-based society, the great transition to urban industrialized society began in the United Kingdom in the 18th century. The reasons why it began in Europe have been discussed and studied by many others, such as Jared Diamond. Regardless of the reasons, it spread throughout first-wave countries seen here on the map. This transition has many aspects to it. There was a population boom. There was an economic boom. These countries started to use ever more energy as they moved from manpower to coal power. There was a dietary transition. Then, in the 1950s, the second-wave countries seen here began the same transition, followed by the third wave at the end of the 20th century. The fourth wave of the remaining countries has now begun. When we look at human development from a 300-year perspective, we start to understand that the Great Transition is taking place everywhere. It simply starts in some places later than others. We also start to see that all countries go through very similar and predictable stages in their development. Understanding this helps us understand the increasing pressure that society and the environment is facing. This video cannot attempt to go through all the aspects of the Great Transition, but here are some examples. Firstly, for urbanization to happen, you need to produce steel, cement, and construction materials to build cities and their infrastructure. We are familiar with this construction boom in second-wave countries such as Brazil, China, and Mexico. Very soon we will be familiar with it in many other countries, particularly in the third and fourth-wave countries. This production process demands not just tremendous amounts of raw materials, but a lot of energy. And just as coal powered the first industrial revolution in the first wave, it continues to power industrialization in countries in the second and third wave. While projections show a rapid increase in the generation of renewable energy, overall energy demand is growing at such a fast pace that coal is projected to continue to power the development of the fourth wave countries. A key criterion for identifying whether an economy is going through the Great Transition is GDP per capita growth. We have become used to GDP growth every year. Our economies depend on it. Governments are thrown out of office if they fail to achieve it. But this was not the norm before the 18th century. Making exact estimates is hard. However, the best attempt to make such estimates is the Madison Project. It estimates that in the 2,000 years leading to the 18th century, GDP grew 0.01% per year and remained extremely low in all regions and all countries in the world. The Madison Project estimates global GDP per capita pre-18th century remained around $400 to $600 in today's figures. This GDP per capita was the peak of the agrarian era's potential. One of the most transformative results of the Great Transition is the growth from less than $1,000 per capita to over $10,000 per capita. An agrarian society simply cannot support such a GDP. First-wave countries achieved this growth in under 100 years. Second-wave countries in less than 50. Another important aspect of the Great Transition is the so-called demographic transition. During this great transition from the agrarian to urban era, most countries have had a demographic boom. In 1900, there were 1.6 billion people. By 2000, there were 6 billion. By the end of the 21st century, most projections estimate that we will reach between 9 and 15 billion. People often blame population growth for problems such as climate change. This is actually only one part of the story. If we had 11 billion people living in the agrarian era, climate change would not be an issue. But it only takes 1 billion people living in the urban industrialized era to cause climate change. This is vital to any conversation about climate change. CO2 levels started growing above 280 ppm in the 1920s for the first time in 3 million years. That was just as a result of the first-wave countries' Great Transition. When so many countries are still so early in the transition, we can only expect already record levels to grow faster still. One of the frustrations the author of 4Waves experienced about debates around climate change was that it was focused on solutions to the world as it is now. Instead, he argues far greater changes are needed to prepare for the world as it will be in 2100, a world with 9 billion urban dwellers. Moreover, we will be damaging far more than the climate along the way, including overusing fresh water and provoking mass extinctions. Levels of urbanization are another key indicator of what stage a country is at during the Great Transition. The Great Transition takes societies from 10% urban and 90% rural to the exact opposite. If we take China as an example, as of 2020, over 60% of its population live in urban areas, a dramatic increase from just under 20% 50 years earlier. China now has 15 cities with over 10 million inhabitants. The second-wave country continues its great transition. This urbanization has far-ranging impacts on the economy, the environment, and society. Among other things, there is a direct link between GDP and urbanization. When people move from rural to urban areas, the result is more energy consumption, industrial and residential buildings built, and so on. Increased wealth allows them to buy more food like meat, milk, and vegetables, which they then store in refrigerators and eat on dishes that they then wash in dishwashers. All these steps are so natural because they mean progress for any family, for any person. Unfortunately, at the macro level, this creates major challenges for humanity. Today, China, like most second-wave countries, had a GDP per capita of $12,300 in 2016, but it started 50 years earlier with $1,400 per capita. GDP per capita figures hide the true scale of economic growth, because at the same time as increasing its GDP per capita 750%, it also more than tripled its population. And China's GDP per capita is still only around a third or less of the level of first-wave countries who have completed the Great Transition. Meanwhile, third-wave countries are only a sixth or less on the way to completing the Great Transition, and fourth-wave countries less than a tenth. In other words, we still have most of the world only part of the way to completing the Great Transition, and the world is already under stress. It is especially important to explain that the author of 4Waves is not suggesting that we prevent growth in one or another country. He is merely emphasizing that the pattern of human development over the past 300 years has led to some very predictable results in growing consumption. This consumption is already placing pressure on society and the environment, and it is set to grow more. The path of development is showing no signs of stopping. In fact, it shows every sign of speeding up. This becomes obvious when looking at human development with a 300-year perspective and acknowledging certain countries are not doomed to poverty. They are simply at an earlier stage in their development. Nor is there much doubt that the third and fourth wave economies will continue to grow. If we look to PricewaterhouseCoopers projections for 2050 in terms of GDP PPP, we can not only see China double its GDP PPP, but also the even faster growth of fourth wave countries, such as Nigeria, which is close to tripling in the same time period. The 4Waves approach connects the many aspects of the Great Transition and shows how countries and societies across the world are all transitioning, though perhaps they are at different stages. In the following videos, we will show you in much more detail the different aspects of the Great Transition, from energy to demography to climate change and much more. We will also discuss whether technology can save humanity from catastrophe and why it is so difficult for political leaders to take action. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to you continuing the course.